Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you today? May you always be healthy and full of blessings. Before starting, let's start by reciting a prayer. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. May this prayer be a way for us to get intercession from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the Day of Judgment. Ameen. Hello Muslim friends, meet again with the Islamic Lantern channel. Before we continue, it would be nice if we support this channel by clicking the subscribe, like, comment, and share buttons. A high priest of the Russian Orthodox Church stood at the pulpit. His voice trembled. Tears streamed down his face. The congregation stared at him in confusion as he spoke words that shook them about Islam, the true religion. What made him feel so shaken and disappointed? Was it the flickering candlelight on the cold floor of an almost empty church in Russia? Or was it the soft, silent snowfall in Kenya, painting a scene that should have felt peaceful? Yet what he felt was anxiety, an unease that grew stronger, weighing heavily on his heart. His eyes fell to a table beside the pulpit. There lay a book, a Russian translation of the Quran, with Arabic script adorning its cover. His hands trembled as he turned page after page. He didn't know why, but something about the book captivated him. He had never intended to study Islam. His encounter with Islamic literature had happened by chance, but somehow every verse he read felt like it was speaking directly to him. He began to question the very concepts he had preached to his congregation. Were they truly from God, or were they merely inherited thoughts, void of divine light? A sense of emptiness began to fill his soul. He was afraid. Dmitri, that was the priest's name, rose from his chair and walked toward the fireplace, its flame still faintly burning. In the cold of the night, he reflected. He had devoted his life to worshiping God through the teachings of the church, believing it to be the path to salvation. But now that belief had begun to crumble. He felt guilty. How could a spiritual leader begin to doubt his own faith? He imagined the reaction of his congregation. What would they say if they knew? What if they lost their faith in the church altogether? But the hardest thing to ignore was the voice within him, a voice that called out to the truth he had long overlooked. With trembling hands, he took back the Quran he had earlier placed on the table. He stared at the cover with doubt, yet also with growing curiosity. He knew that reading deeper would mean allowing himself to be swept away by more difficult questions. But he also realized that perhaps the answers he had long been searching for were in there. He opened the first page. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, wrapping the air in a special kind of silence. The snowflakes sparkled like diamonds under the streetlights. He knew it wasn't a place he usually visited, but somehow something had drawn him there. Inside the shop, the atmosphere was warm and calm. The aroma of black tea and spices filled the air, creating a sense of familiarity in the middle of the freezing winter. He saw a man sitting in the corner of the room, wearing a thick, dark brown coat. The man was a Muslim academic, a doctor and professor in the field of religious history at one of Russia's leading universities. Dmitri sat across from him, holding a teacup and feeling its warmth in the palm of his hand. He sighed restlessly. "I've read parts of the Quran," he said softly. "There are so many similarities with the holy book I've followed. But about God, Islam describes God as truly one, with no intermediaries. Our church teaches the Trinity." The professor looked at him calmly. "That's Tawheed," he replied, "the belief that God is absolutely one." "I've never heard this perspective before," Dmitri said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But hearing it directly from someone who truly understands Islam makes me even more restless. I tried to find flaws in the argument, but somehow it all makes sense." He paused for a moment, then spoke again, more hesitantly. "If Jesus is just a prophet, what about salvation? In my belief, Jesus is the Savior. This is all so different from what I believed my whole life," he thought. "But why can't I ignore the truth in his words?" The professor looked at him gently, his gaze full of meaning. "I don't want you to just believe," he said, "but if you truly seek the truth, then keep searching. God always shows the way to those who sincerely seek it." Dmitri stared at his teacup, now half empty. Outside, the snow was still falling, slowly, as if mirroring the confusion spinning in his mind. He had come for a meeting, but maybe he had also come to find something. He had hoped to find an answer that would strengthen his faith, but instead he was met with even more questions, questions that shook his heart. When they finally parted ways, Dmitri walked home with heavy steps. The verses he had just heard echoed in his mind, making his thoughts increasingly chaotic. He knew this was not the end of his search. This was just the beginning. The next day, Dmitri Smirnov sat pensively in his room. The dim light cast slow-moving shadows on the wall, dancing with the small flickers from the fireplace. Outside, the cold winter wind blew fiercely, shaking the bare branches of the trees. Snow had been falling since the afternoon, still blanketing the city in white and deepening the sense of stillness. On the wooden table in front of him, the Quran and the Bible lay side by side. His hands moved restlessly, tracing the covers of the two holy books. Since his discussion with Dr. Kidd a few days ago, his mind had not known peace. He tried to go about his routine, leading services, delivering sermons to his congregation, and praying as he always had. But his heart remained filled with an anxiety he couldn't explain. That night, exhaustion made him fall asleep earlier than usual. But in his sleep, he experienced something he had never felt before. In his dream, he found himself in a strange place. A vast desert stretched out before him. The sky glowed a golden orange, like the setting sun. There was no sign of life around him, only the endless expanse of sand rolling with the wind. He felt weightless, as if he wasn't truly walking, but floating above the ground. Suddenly, from a distance, appeared the figure of a man in a white robe. His face was pure, radiant, and full of tranquility. Every step he took was graceful, though his feet did not touch the ground. Dmitri couldn't take his eyes off him. There was something about this man, something that made all his inner struggles feel worthwhile. He felt that his long homework had all led to this moment, a sign. He wanted to know more about who this man was, but his body felt paralyzed, unable to move. Then the man spoke. His voice was calm, yet pierced deeply into Dmitri's soul. "Open your eyes. Read. Reflect upon these words." Dmitri woke up. Beside his bed was a small table. On it lay two sacred books, the Bible and the Quran. His hand trembled slightly. After a moment's hesitation, he reached for the Quran and opened a page at random. His eyes immediately fell upon a verse. "So remind, for indeed the reminder benefits those who believe." The verse struck him. It felt like a direct response to what he had just experienced in the dream. His heart trembled. He was no longer merely a priest who taught without question. He had become a seeker, someone who longed for truth. The dream, the man in the white robe, the verse. They all seemed like parts of the same message, coming together as one. Was this mere coincidence, or was God truly guiding him down a path he had never imagined? Dmitri closed the Quran slowly. His body was still buzzing with subtle energy. Deep inside, he knew this was no ordinary dream. Something far greater was unfolding in his life. That night, for the first time, Dmitri prostrated, not as a high priest of the Orthodox Church, not as a religious figure revered by many, but as a man, one who was seeking the truth with his own heart. Snow was still falling gently across the night sky as Dmitri stood before a simple building with a small dome and a short tower. A mosque. Quiet on the outside, yet within his heart, a storm of faith had begun to rise. The mosque was not as grand as the old churches in the city. It lacked the elaborate ornaments and stained glass windows he had grown accustomed to as a high priest. Yet there was something in its simplicity, something quiet, serene, that made him feel as if he had found a part of himself that had long been missing. He took a deep breath. His heart was beating faster than usual. Despite preparing himself for this visit, doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. What if the people inside rejected him? What if his presence as a Christian high priest was seen as a threat? But something compelled him to keep moving. The memory was still fresh, the figure in the robe, the gentle words that felt like balm to the soul, the green prayer mat laid out neatly, the peaceful faces in silent worship. And then there were the words he couldn't forget. You don't have to become a Muslim to find peace. Sometimes peace is the first step before faith. Just sit, listen, reflect. He remembered how those words softened something deep within him. Dmitri was silent now, letting those feelings settle. He finally whispered, almost to himself, I don't know if I'm truly seeking the truth, or if I'm just lost. He paused, then continued, but when I read the Quran, I feel like I'm discovering something greater than anything I've ever known. Yusuf, the man beside him, nodded slowly and replied with calm certainty. Every sincere search for truth leads to the light. In Islam, we are taught that a pure heart will always be guided, no matter where it begins. Dmitri looked down. I've led a church, I've taught the gospel to so many, but maybe there's something more. Yusuf smiled gently. Truth doesn't belong to one moment in time. Even during the Prophet's life, some of the strongest believers began as opponents. The journey is what matters. Dmitri felt as if he stood at a crossroads. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him, but then the Adhan began, the call to prayer. It was soft, yet full of strength, melodious, commanding, yet peaceful. The voice flowed through the mosque like a river of light, reaching into places within him he hadn't even known existed. He had heard the call to prayer before, but never like this. This time, it touched something deep. He closed his eyes. He knew his journey had only just begun. Later, in the quiet of his study filled with books, Dmitri sat alone. His thoughts were caught in a labyrinth, one not of confusion, but of awakening. He looked at the open Bible on his desk. For the first time in his life, the words on the page didn't bring the clarity they once had. Something had changed. The peace he once knew now seemed distant as he turned to the Quran, a book that had revealed a new perspective to him. But now, as he grasped its deeper meanings, fear crept in. Islam had found a place in his heart, but in the church environment, Dmitri imagined the faces of his congregation, people who had depended on him for spiritual guidance. How could he explain to them that he had found the truth elsewhere? How could he betray their trust? He wiped his face, guilt enveloping him. But more than that, a greater fear settled in. A fear of the personal repercussions he would face if he announced that he had accepted Islam. Mrs. Hanan, trying to hide her own anxiety, had warned him, "You will be branded as someone who has never been saved from your fate." A young priest, Alexei, walked in with a friendly expression. "Mr. Dmitri, I just wanted to check on you. These past few days you seem different, like something is weighing on your mind." Dmitri smiled faintly, but he knew it was not enough to hide his anxiety. "Thank you, Alexei. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately." He hesitated, struggling to express what was in his heart. Something was holding him back. How could he explain that? For so long, he had felt something was missing. The more he read the Quran, the more he felt its teachings resonated with him in ways the church's teachings had not. But how could he admit that? He couldn't even explain it to himself fully. Alexei nodded, offering a comforting presence. "Sometimes we are faced with difficult questions, Dmitri." Dmitri's mind flashed to a verse from the Quran, Surah Az-Zumar, verse 23. That verse weighed heavily on his chest, and he wanted to pray but felt lost, unsure of how to approach it, how to even kneel and prostrate. He had longed for guidance, but now his heart was torn. The cold air of Moscow felt sharper than usual. Snow had been falling since morning, blanketing the streets in a quiet stillness, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Dmitri's heart. He stood in front of the mirror in his private room, dressed in his priestly robe, his hands trembling. Today would change everything. He gazed at his reflection and saw a man who had devoted his life to the church, loved and respected by his congregation. But that man no longer existed. He had found a truth that could no longer be denied. The burden of it was too great to bear. In the quiet of his room, Dmitri's thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "What have you done, Dmitri?" It was a voice from the past, a colleague, an old priest who always sat in the pews, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've lost your way," the voice seemed to whisper. Dmitri couldn't stand the imagined scorn, but the truth inside him grew stronger. He knew this was the path he had to follow, yet fear gripped him. What would people think? What would his congregation say? Would they understand? Would they hate him? Still, for the first time in his life, Dmitri felt a sense of peace he had never known. He had found God, not in the familiar halls of the church, but in the teachings of Islam. Snow continued to fall outside, and as the cold settled in, a warmth he had never known began to envelop him. Days passed, and Dmitri visited the Muslim community in the city more often. He learned not only from books, but also from people who practiced Islam with a deep, heartfelt devotion. Despite the challenges, Dmitri's resolve grew stronger. However, his trials were far from over. One night, as he walked home from the mosque, Dmitri felt the presence of someone following him. He quickened his pace, but footsteps behind him matched his every move. As he rounded a corner, he was confronted by a group of men, their faces obscured, but their eyes burning with hatred. "You think you can betray the church and get away with it?" one of them spat. Dmitri's heart raced, but he stood tall. This was the moment of truth. The voice of one of them was heard. Dmitri stood silent, calmly observing them. The high priest, now a Muslim, stood by as other priests sneered awkwardly. A punch landed on his stomach, making him stumble, but he didn't fight back. "Is this your idea of strength?" A shout rang out. The attacker, panic in his eyes, retreated, leaving Dmitri in peace. That night, Dmitri sat in Rashid's house, a warm cup of tea in his hands, surrounded by prayers from his Muslim brothers. He realized that his life would never be the same again. Amidst all the threats and challenges, he felt calmer than ever before. Not only had he found the truth, but he had also found a new family that embraced him with open arms. A great blessing. Thin snowflakes fell softly in the quiet morning, covering the rooftops of the small house. The dim light from the window reflected on Dmitri's calm face. Though his heart raced, he felt an undeniable peace. Several men sat in a small circle around him. Among them was Rashid, a new friend who had guided him on this journey. In front of him, the imam sat with a serene expression. He smiled and nodded slightly, signaling Dmitri to begin. Dmitri took a deep breath, pulling the words from deep within his heart. He had memorized them for weeks. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, looking at the imam with unwavering confidence. Ashhadu alla ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. The room fell silent for a moment before the sound of takbir echoed from the people around him. Rashid smiled broadly and gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder, his hand warm against Dmitri's skin. Tears welled up in his eyes, though he couldn't express everything he was feeling in words. This was a significant moment in his journey, one that he would carry with him forever. He felt the warmth of the words spoken to him, realizing that his life was about to change drastically. He had lost many positions of honor in his society, and many people he once considered friends had drifted away. But in this quiet space, he had found something precious. Peace, his new home. He opened the Quran, his loyal companion over the past few months, and began reading verse by verse, letting its meaning sink into his heart. As his eyes moved across the pages, he came upon a verse that touched him deeply. Whomsoever Allah wills to guide, He opens their heart to Islam. Quran, Surah. Dmitri's heart skipped a beat. The truth was undeniable. That night, he knew his journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. He had found his path and was ready to share it with anyone who sought the same. The sky above the mosque was clear, but in Dmitri's heart, it was brighter than ever before. This is the end of our video. If you enjoy Islamic content like this, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.